this episode, we have David Wolpert from SFI, Santa Fe Institute, to talk about thermodynamics of meaning and quite a lot more. Give me a little bit of background of why you wanted to have David on the pod.
I find David to be one of the world's most fascinating minds. He's incredible at being able to link different ideas, and I love the way that, as he describes himself, as just following things that are interesting. Yeah. Now, this discussion that we having with him is about a paper that he co-wrote with Artemy Kolchinsky, who was, I think, his postdoc at the time, a few years ago, and it's called Semantic Information, Autonomous Agency, and Non-Equilibrium Statistical Physics. This is the most technical discussion, really, that we've had on artificiality in many respects, because what this is about how meaning can be mathematized and put in what is the math of something being meaningful. And it goes pretty deep into some of the concepts of the artificiality, which is essentially about what do living things want to stay alive, and that how that persists over time, how that could transition into the way that artificial systems behave, how AI could basically help us by helping us think about what it is that makes us want to persist.
So I will jump in here just to give listeners a heads up that while the paper is very mathematical, the
conversation is not.
Is not. No. It's actually quite approachable.
There's a lot of discussion about cake.
There's a lot of discussion about cake. Some discussion about teenagers. A lot of discussion about meaning. And stick around for the very end to make sure you hear what David is working on now. Which can be, you could hear it as a little bit frightening, but I'm really glad that somebody's working on it because I think it's quite important.
Yeah, and
it will be meaningful to us all.
And we did actually write about that in mid-December, so we'll include a link to that as well.
Awesome, great. Well, we'll leave you to the conversation with David Wolpert. David, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to talk to you today. This is going to be fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with an opening question about inspiration. Curious to know what inspires you in your work, what inspires you to pursue this particular, the topics that you do?
Wow, that's a very broad one. The dumb joke I sometimes say about myself is that I'm a person with no discipline, because I actually change disciplines about once every decade. There's many aspects of this. What inspires me is, frankly, if something is deeply, deeply interesting. My original PhD was physics. I was actually originally working in quantum gravity. I looked around one year and saw that there were 50 people graduating with PhDs that year and one opening. I did a little math and decided that I needed to work on something else. It turned out that when I was, before coming to grad school, I spent 1 year running the computer systems at what was then the Rockefeller University Neurosciences Institute. And while there, I started working on what is now called AI. Intermediately, it was called machine learning. Back then, nobody was doing any of it. So this was actually just after I was an undergrad. My thinking was, look, symbolic AI, which is what people had been considering up till then, this is just not going anywhere, folks. Read the writing on the wall. What might be another approach? Oh, what if we just actually try to do, in essence, more sophisticated versions of interpolation? Maybe that might be a fruitful way to actually start making progress on starting to understand artificial systems that in some sense are quote unquote intelligent. So I started playing around with that this year while I was running the Neurosciences Institute's computers. I still remember it being very spooky. My first system I designed, the way you always do these things, you sort of start with the name and you work backwards. This was Herbie and I figured out that stood for Heuristic Binary Engine. But it was a very, very simple kind of a surface fitting algorithm that could also do things like the two spiral separation problem and things. And I remember the very first time giving it a quote training set and asking it a test set questions and getting them right. That felt a kind of spooky. It was a proverbial bit of a frisson, and I thought, oh, well, this is cool. So I did some more work on that. And anyway, I had this in my back pocket when I decided that no quantum gravity, 50 PhDs, one postdoc opening, I've got to go into something else. At the time, physicists were really, really interested in neural nets, spin glasses, kind of like they are again now. So even though I ended up getting a physics PhD, what it actually amounted to in my PhD thesis was taking all this work I had already done, deriving a whole bunch of wheels, as the phrase goes, reinventing a whole bunch of wheels, cross-validation, genetic algorithms, algorithmic information theory, a whole bunch of those kinds of things which had already been done, along with a lot of extensions that were completely new. And so that was my thesis. That was machine learning. That was, I later learned that that was what was called machine learning. And that's how I got started. Eventually, there were a whole bunch of things. We could get into it. I was very badly, in essence, abused as a postdoc. I generated these things called no free lunch theorems. And I was kind of eviscerated for that, which left a very, very bad taste in my mouth. That's partly what pushed me away from machine learning into other fields. But I also, to be quite honest, got a little bit bored with it. It got too easy. And I was very interested at the time. I started to become very interested. By now, I was actually at NASA Ames Research Center and with Stanford Aeroastro Department, of all places. And I was very interested in doing distributed control where you treat, so for example, distributed fleets of drones that me and my students used to fly around Stanford campus. The way that we would do that is we would actually have each drone be a reinforcement learning algorithm. We made the approximation that each of them was its own individual human being. And then we said, okay, all these human beings are interacting in an economy that we design so that the joint set of all of these drones, just like on the cartoon of the invisible hand hypothesis of Adam Smith, that we can control all of these drones by having each one be its own artificial intelligence, where we are designing the way that they are interacting so it's just like a human economy, and using techniques of economics to control this constellation of drones and so on. And that's the time when I started becoming very interested in artificial intelligence in a much more distributed sense, viewing things like an entire human economy as being intelligent. And therefore, if I make an artificial human economy where each of the people in the economy is replaced by something like an RL algorithm, so the whole thing is artificial, not only is each individual RL algorithm in a certain sense intelligent, but so is the economy as a whole. And what can I do with those kinds of issues? These are some of the reasons why I was interested in AI from way, way back when. But I've also been doing a whole bunch of other things. For that work on intelligent economies, collective intelligence, we actually called it. We were the first people to actually use that word several decades ago. Some papers actually in NIPS and things like this, as it was called back then. That work has elaborated into certain directions, but it also got me very interested in game theory and microeconomic theory, because that was so central to these kinds of artificial intelligences that were artificial economies. So I started doing a whole bunch of work on that for a long time. I also then, when I came back to the Santa Fe Institute, got very, very interested in some deep work in statistical physics. Basically, there's been a revolution in statistical physics during the turn of the millennium. It's called stochastic thermodynamics. This is a whole nother discussion we can have, many discussions, but it provides tools to analyze the thermodynamic aspects of all kinds of systems, including computers, the one I'm looking into now, and the ones in your desk, that we were beyond our ability to even think about them before. So, spiraling around to your question, what's the unifying theme here? There ain't one. I am not able to keep myself from going over into considering fascinating issues once I become fascinating. That's how I went from machine learning of individual systems to, in essence, some AIs of economies, and from there on to game theory. And I'm now doing a whole bunch of work in deep history, in modeling the dynamics of whole human societies. So I sort of jumped from one to the other because I really can't stop myself. That's the sense in which the dumb joke, I'm somebody without any discipline. I would not recommend this path to anybody. It's damned risky. I never lose sight of just how freaking lucky I am. Not just that I'm able to have run this career trajectory for all of the difficulties and challenges I encountered, but also I think all of us are. You just compare yourself to 99% of the people out there who work to live that kind of a thing. They're 9 to 5, punch a card, and that's only in the rich part of the world. We compare ourselves to the, as it's called now, global south, where it's a matter of, do I get any food to eat today? I am freaking lucky. And I almost would characterize that as the core feature of my career. I tried never to lose sight of that on so many different levels, that to be able to, I can't imagine not doing what I do.
It's fascinating that you say that, because it's sort of visible from the outside, because. And obviously you don't have to write too many grant proposals. It's
I do, but yeah.
but it's like, imagine trying to pull all of these disciplines together, and so being able to follow this path of interestingness
Yep.
is sort of how I would almost classify you from the outside. The thing that grabbed me, because I do a lot of this roving around looking what's interesting to me as well, is a number of the things that you've written over the years, but the paper that sort of grabbed me that we wanted to talk about today, which is around the thermodynamics of information, and this difference between syntactic information and Claude Shannon's work, and semantic information, which is that sort of next layer that people intuitively understand when you describe it to them. But then moving into this world of mutual information and causal information, that as I read the paper, and we'll discuss it in a minute, but as I read it, what formed in my mind was a sense of, wow, this is really going to matter for how we think about whether AI understands meaning, whether AI understands us, how we think about meaning, and how we think about life, and how we think about survival. And there were just so many questions that came to me. I thought, I'm going to have to talk to David about this, because it was so sort of, for such a parsimonious paper, it just sort of triggered so many questions for me. But I think for viewers of this, it might be really helpful to go back and get a bit of history about this particular idea, how you see the differences, and that some of the definitions here that really matter, because that forms a bit of a basis for us to sort of get to some of those more either technical or even philosophical questions.
Yeah. So it's actually a very nice segue from what we were talking about before. Um, I think it's very, very crucial in life that everybody knows what the comparative advantage is and what it is not. Um, there are some truly brilliant people out there, far, far smarter than I could even imagine to be. But a side effect of bouncing around from all these different fields, what is my comparative advantage, I guess, is that I I know at least some level of depth many, many different kinds of things, and I can just bring them together, pick from this from over there and that from over here. And that's kind of what the genesis of that particular paper was. So to give historical context, Claude Shannon, another dumb joke I sometimes make about Shannon as well as Kolmogorov, that these people aren't normal humans. They one of two things: either they were aliens in disguise, or they were time travelers from the future, because they just did too many brilliant things for any single human being to have possibly come up with. It's just insane. So one of the things that Shannon did, as you were mentioning, was he came up with information theory. And he's explicit in his first paper that what he is considering is only what's called syntactic versus semantic information. And let me explain that. Let's say I've got a bunch of bits. For example, the bits are an encoding of the images that we are seeing right now in this video meeting. And I want to get them from my camera and my computer across some intermediate noisy, they're called channels, they're literally wires or cell phone signals, things like this, radio signals, over to you. I don't care at all what they actually mean, what they're about, their semantics. I don't care that these are actually images versus sounds versus just downloads of the Encyclopedia Britannica. They could be anything, but I want to get them from here to there, despite the fact that there's noise in between, with as little distortion as possible. I just want to get the syntax, namely the string of bits from A to B, despite the fact that there's noise in between that's trying to muck up with those bits. How do I do this? What's the best I can do? That's what Shannon's information theory is all about. He was explicit in his paper saying, I am only considering this. I'm not considering all the other stuff. But in any case, be that as it may, it's an extraordinarily deep, profound body of work. It is still a major, major field of research to this day, information theory. It has been the basis for many very deep, fascinating investigations of the human brain. There's all kinds of things that we now know are that are amazing about various information channels within the brain. For example, from the retinas in your eye back to your visual systems, that just how close the brain gets to the information theoretic bounds on the best that is actually conceivable. It's stunning. But it doesn't say anything about what the actual content of all of those strings of bits, whether they be from one neuron to another or from my computer to the other, anything what they're about. So, needless to say, since then, people have been worrying about how do we define semantic information. Shannon himself worked on this at depth. The obvious starting point is to say that the semantic information for me of seeing a cake over there versus seeing a rock over there is that I value the cake more than the rock. This is the kind of thing that certainly occurred to me first with my having done some work in economics and game theory and so on. So to put it in a more science speak language, we have an exogenously specified utility function, something that's completely external to David, that is saying this is how much David values this versus that. And this external evaluation, that's called a utility function. And my semantic information of learning something about the cake or where the cake is or something like that compared to learning something about the rock or where the rock is. The syntactic information learning where the rock is versus learning where the cake is. It's the same string of bits, just the position of a rock versus the position of a cake. The semantic information is very, very different. I care about the one and not about the other. Okay, good, but there's an obvious problem here in that you've got to have this, quote, exogenously specified, meaning outside of the system, arbitrary utility function. Give me that, and I can tell you what the semantic value of information is, fine. But how are we going to use this to get any kind of general handle on semantic information, a handle of the same sort that Shannon's work provided for syntactic information? People have been wrestling with that for decades and decades. Okay, so then as an example of the benefits of having bounced around from a bunch of different fields, I had come across in other work, while thinking about this particular question, some work by a fellow called Judah Pearl. He won either, I think it's a Turing Award or an Turing Award, yeah. Fascinating guy. He's actually, I think, the uncle of Daniel Pearl, who was a journalist who was killed by terrorists, Islamic terrorists in Pakistan.
Yeah, I've heard him talk about that.
Yeah. So he's got a great backstory, so to speak, and he's done some fascinating work. In particular, he's worked on what you were referring to before, Helen, and I'll circle to it a little bit, called causal information. And I'd read about that stuff. And as far as I was concerned, Judah's definition of causality is the final word on the issue. This is it. This defines it, makes perfect sense, explains everything, nothing more to be said. This is now a tool in my own personal toolbox. In addition, as I mentioned, I have been encountering the work in stochastic thermodynamics, those revolutionary breakthroughs in statistical physics that all these other brilliant physicists had come up with. I also knew about that. And of course, I knew about Shannon's syntactic information. And so I realized, and then was, after this, I started to become helped with by a postdoc that I recruited at the time, Artemy Kolchinsky. But I realized we can pull these three things together to define, in essence, not an exogenously specified definition of the semantic information of David knowing where a cake is, but rather the endogenously specified, that David and his own characteristics, once you combine that with stochastic thermodynamics and Judah Pearl's notion of causal information, this provides a solution. So that's how I came across it, or stumbled into thinking about this kind of an approach. And so here's the idea. Independent of any exogenously specified preference functions, utility functions, whatever you want to call it for David, there is one thing that as an agent, any agent, what is uppermost in its utility function, no matter what else you put on, which is that it gets to persist into the future. Or to put it another way, this is a common feature of all agents that we can simply ascribe to them as something that they value, that has high utility. I want to still be here next year, 10 years, 100 years, alas, that doesn't seem to be possible, but whatever. I want to persist in a certain sense of the word want. Similarly with a paramecium, similarly with the dog behind my shoulder over there, so on and so forth. Any agent, a robot, same kind of a thing. Squirrely issues about whether LLMs might quote unquote want to persist, but we can certainly ascribe that to them as a background goal, even if we cannot query them, do you want to live, and get any kind of a meaningful answer. So, okay, let's just say that anything wants to persist. Now, next question, and this is where I'm going to reach over to stochastic thermodynamics. What does it mean for me to persist into the future? What is some kind of universal feature that any agent has of any physical system that one might even think in some sense does have desires of any sort whatsoever, imputed or explicitly voiced? It's that it's not at equilibrium. It's not at thermal equilibrium. If I were at thermal equilibrium right now, I would just be some dust and some water. I am a very, very far from thermal equilibrium system. In essence, that is one of the core criteria of anything that's alive. This insight goes back to Schrödinger in his famous book, What is Life?, which is really the foundation of all of the origins of life research being done today. All of the entire field of artificial life is that book by Schrödinger. And one of the major things that he points out is any living system, it is very far from thermal equilibrium. Okay, we can now exploit that insight of Schrödinger to say that what it means for me to persist is that I'm going to be alive in the future, and so therefore I've got to be away from thermal equilibrium. So that's the first key. One thing that it's going to mean, I'm going to assign to any system as its goal, as it's part of its utility function, not the whole thing, but part of it, is that I want to be away from thermal equilibrium, not arbitrarily so, but in a state that's very similar to the one I have now, persist into the future. Okay, good. We have part of it, but that's still not telling us anything about the semantic information about something in my environment. Here is where we can go into and use some of the tools of Judah Pearl. I will now stipulate the following. Let's say there's some information in the environment which will causally affect whether David is going to be outside of thermal equilibrium in the future. For example, if I learn from my environment causal information coming into me, meaning it affects me, that's what causal means, I learn where a cake is, that it's just over there. That causal information from the environment, I then can use that to exploit all the calories in that cake, assuming I don't eat it all at once, get kind of sick. I can now use the calories in that cake to help ensure that I will be alive in the future, at least in this minimal sense of that I can just define a necessary condition for being alive is that I'm outside of thermal equilibrium. We can take that information from the environment that has a causal effect on the agent, where that causal effect means it can use that information about the environment to actually stay out of thermal equilibrium in the future. Bang! That defines for us how much semantic information there is. The amount of semantic information from the environment, I'm just going to define it now by saying how much does that actually causally affect me to be able to keep away from thermal equilibrium in the future. Bing, bang, done. The rest of it, it's not the devil, it's the goddess. The God is in the details. But the rest of it is then mathematizing that, actually pulling in the tools of Judah, applying them in the formal sense, pulling in the tools of stochastic thermodynamics. Needless to say, all kinds of subtleties and richnesses arise. A whole bunch of them were described in that paper you were alluding to, Helen. But that's basically where it comes from. And I'm not sure how completely clear that would be. So interrogate me. Let's elaborate that kind of thinking.
Okay, so let me see if I can back up and put it into my own words. Maybe there's a question here. The shift to an endogenous utility function actually requires that causal information is able to be used from the environment to be able to to be able to know how far you can
Well, actually, that part of things is not necessary for the endogenous versus exogenous. Very, very good question. So we can go back historically. Pearl's causal information, it's very, very close to what's called Granger causality in economics. Granger actually won a Nobel Prize in large part for this. It's basically trying to get at the question, as we all know, correlation does not imply causation. Okay, we got that cliche. Granger causality, Pearl's causal information, these kinds of things formalize what that difference is. So, in the context of economics, which is everything is exogenous utility functions, Granger causality was used. It was motivated to answer the question, I'm a finance company, and I'm going to be looking at the time series of other financial instruments, and I'm noticing these particular two are correlated. Well, to be current, that one of them is levels of tariffs is correlated with whether you're in a recession or not, which is true. Whole nother discussion there. So, but I want to know which is causally dependent on which other one, because if I'm a finance company, I want to know whether changing one of those variables is going to causally affect the other one. I want to know if changing the level of tariffs is going to affect the probability of going into recession, not just that they're correlated. Granger causality allows us to know that, so that when there's an intervention on the one variable, that the level of tariffs is increased, I can now know we're much more likely to enter into a recession, and therefore I, as a finance company, can short the economy, and I can make money when the recession does actually come to pass. So that was the kind of motivation that Granger was using. That's all about exogenous utility functions. The more general formulation of it, which doesn't have to do with utility functions at all, is one of the things that Judah Pearl added to things, to the whole approach. So when I say that I'm using Pearl's causal information, in a certain sense, it's also the same as Granger's at a formal level. Certainly, they're very closely related. And that itself doesn't have to do with exogenous versus endogenous. The exogenous versus endogenous, that aspect of things is being addressed by Schrödinger. What is life? Life is to stay away from thermal equilibrium into the future. And so I'm going to say, okay, I'm just going to start with that. Your endogenous utility function, Schrödinger gave us the answer. What is your endogenous utility function? You're staying away from thermal equilibrium into the future. Bing, bang, done. And oh, by the way, there's this other tool over there called stochastic thermodynamics that allows us to actually, when we get into the nitty-gritty mathematics of all this, bring all these things together in a much cleaner way. We can get these various puzzle pieces to actually line up. Does that clarify it at all?
Yeah, I think so. It does make me want to ask, because I know Dave's going to want to get to some questions, but it does make me want to ask about mutual information and where that fits in. It might help me like click into this and then get to like meaning, as in how humans think about meaning.
So if we're only looking at correlations, mutual information is the way to do so. If you and I, Helen, if our states are correlated, which they sort of are in this conversation, that is quantified a la Shannon as the mutual information. It's got to do with some variants of his definitions of entropy, to say in a purely syntactic way, not semantic, syntactic, how correlated our states are. It turns out that, sorry, my nose, due to the allergies. It turns out that Pearl's causal information flow work, it was extended in a really cool paper by Nihat I and Daniel Polanyi. So in any case, mutual information between you and me, the standard Shannon sense, that says how, so it's a information theoretic as opposed to a statistical way of saying how correlated we are. Mm-hmm. So rather than saying how correlated we are is in terms of things like, you may have heard of what's called the Pearson statistic, which is just basically the covariance, the correlation in standard statistics, where we have a joint probability distribution and this, that, and the other. Shannon's work provides a much more generally grounded, much more rich in some senses definition just of how correlated we are. Pearl, we can take his work, and this is what this other paper by Palani and Nihat I did. They showed how to do this. Take Pearl's work on causality, combine it with mutual information to come up with causal mutual information. So that's a way of saying not how correlated am I with you, but how much does your state actually cause my state, to get at that issue. So it's an extension of mutual information by combining it with Pearl's stuff, so we can actually look beyond just correlation to causation. Because what we want to know is how much does changing the state of where that cake is in my environment cause me to behave in a different way that either would or would not allow me to go pick up the cake and therefore stay out of thermal equilibrium. It's a bunch of separate steps. That's how it all comes together.
And I want to see if I can just help shift gears to be able to get to this sort of next stage of the conversation. That what we have here now is a mathematically rigorous way of talking about, as agents embedded in an environment, we can essentially establish a sense, really meaning with the environment. What does the environment mean to us, and what do we mean to the environment? And the word I want to put on that right now, rightly or wrongly, is context, which is a word that we hear a lot of in the world of AI. What's the context? Does it understand the context of the question that you put into ChatGPT, or a broader context of some other more powerful use of AI that we're developing, or some future state that we want to imagine that we have with AI? And Dave does a lot of thinking about that word, a lot of thinking about context, a lot of thinking about how do we imagine the way that AIs could work with us in the future, that use these concepts, that we're able to see that there's to get more fluent in using words like, well, that's a semantic AI, for example. I'm struggling at this point, but it's a. How do you think about the word context now? Does that word mean the same thing to you now? How do you model that word yourself?
That's a fascinating idea. I'm not so much interested in dictionary definitions and semantics, as it's sometimes called. Do I call it context or not? Let me rephrase your idea and see if this is consonant with what you have in mind. Let's elaborate the semantic information framework so that what we want that agent, its semantic information is going to involve not its own persisting into the future, staying out of thermal equilibrium, but some other organism doing so. So to formulate in that one sense, the semantic information of a cake in the environment to a mother of a newborn could involve the newborns extending into the future. She herself, the mother, might not need the cake, but if it helps her child persist into the future, though I don't know if you want to feed cakes to newborn babies, but be that as it may, if it helps the child persist into the future, then that's semantic information sort of one step removed. It's indirect. The endogenous utility function is endogenous of something other than me. But that's fine. We can still say how much does my learning about something environment, that causal information on me, help keep the system out of thermal equilibrium. So now let's replace mother and child with LLM and humanity.
Mm-hmm.
You can almost, one way I think I could maybe interpret your idea would be that this is a very, very general setting, provides a very generally, broadly applicable formalization for things related to AI safety almost. That rather than try to give an AI, an LLM, whatever, foundational, whatever, an AI, as a set of criteria, something that's analogous to Asimov's laws of robotics. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that, which, as Asimov's stories show, is a almost doomed to fail kind of approach. Just do some huge laundry list of things you want to build into an AI. Instead, kick it up a level. So if we get reasoning AIs, and that's what seems to be happening, have the AI build into it that it's always reasoning about what the effects would be of its behavior on humanity staying out of thermal equilibrium. Is that getting somewhat
That's
closer?
getting quite close. What if I give you a scenario? Say the context is it's an AI, one AI that works with an individual person. So, and its job is to help that individual person persist, and that individual person, say, is a risk-taking teenager, and the environment.
Good luck, AI.
And teenagers take risks for reasons that some of them we know, some of them we don't. I mean, we sort of know it, like at a population level, you need a certain degree of explore, and some of that teenage risk taking is exploring to the edge, right? But if that's the context, then how do we think about how an AI could be constructed? Like, what would its exogenous, and would it have an endogenous utility function? Would its reasoning capabilities build its own internal algorithms for this?
This is cool. Good ideas. Okay, so two things here. The semantic information framework, it's got, as you were actually highlighting earlier in this discussion, it's got a couple of it's got many moving parts. One of them is Judah Pearl, Granger causality. What is not just a correlation from the environment onto David, because that's not going to define any of the, if we wanted to say how much information is there in that environment concerning, that's the semantic value of the information in the environment for David, it's got to be actually affecting David causally. If it's just correlational, then who cares? So that's one piece, and there's Pearl, as I said, Daniel Polanyi, Granger, etc., etc. Cool, we got that in our back pocket. That's one tool. Then there's the other one that I pulled into the paper, Schrödinger. What is life? You're on a thermal equilibrium. Oh, look, we can now use stochastic thermodynamics tools. Cool, cool, cool. Bring all these things together. And then there are examples in the paper that you're mentioning concerning things like hurricanes that are persisting by taking information from the environment down to chimpanzees. And there's all kinds of these examples that we went through to stress test that. Cool. These are different components. So far as I know, nobody's tried to do this. We could actually use them separately. Just take the causal information stuff and use that, apply that for an exogenous utility function rather than endogenous of that teenager. So one could imagine something like an AI, we'll call it a nanny AI or something like that, a chaperone AI, who knows what you want to call it, that it's got as its utility function, keep little Jane or John, as the case might be, Jack or Jill, keep them safe into the future, and then have that AI, what's it going to care about for the information in the environment? What's that got to do with things? It's because that AI says, okay, to make sure that I know how to keep this teenager safe, I've got to learn this other information. For that utility function, here is something that's got a lot of causal value for me to be able to keep my charge, and that's in any sense of the word, safe. That doesn't have any such value, so therefore I must seek out the stuff with more semantic value of information, those aspects of my context. Not all aspects of my context are created equally. Is that then more resonant with your thinking?
Well, I think it is, because what it's making me consider is how what the math could do is actually provide a formal mechanism for an AI to be able to actually seek more semantic information as the environment changes.
Yep. In most of what we have done so far, we just said, here it is. Here is the amount of semantic information. Bing, bang, done. But if we're talking about AIs that are making decisions, that are doing things, then what do we care about semantic information? Oh, I see. Because we could have a goal of the AI to go out and try to find things with more semantic information. It could be a reinforcement learning AI where it is trying to go out and seek and uncover those aspects of its environment that have large semantic value for it, as far as whatever its goal is, the teenager or anything else. Let's go completely monetary. I want to be rich. You're my AI. You can't take in all the information that's out there and treat it all equally. You won't be able to ascertain how to actually control David's stock portfolio or whatever going into the future. But what you can do is go out there and try to find which information in the environment has more causal value, is going to have more effect, knowing its value, on the future of David's stock. That you can then do as part of your criteria for how to manage his portfolio. Maybe something like that?
Well, it makes me think of just so many interesting metrics, like the different. So there have been a couple of papers recently that have pointed out that AIs have like some of these large language models have a better understanding of their own accuracy than humans do when they get an output, right? And it makes me think, well, I'd like an AI to be able to tell me what almost the delta between what I think is causally relevant to my life versus at this moment in the environment versus what it thinks is causally relevant. So AKA that's kind of like a measure of denial, right? So I'm denying this part of the information world. So Dave's looking at me with a skeptical look saying, but my mind thinks of all of these new kind of metrics that an AI might be able to, that what's the difference between how I'm perceiving the environment and what I think is meaningful in the environment versus what an AI thinks. But the AI has a different perception, if you like, terrible word to use there, but AI has a different conception of the choices available to me than maybe I do. So there's this choice delta too, because you like to think about choices as how we establish this meaning. You got to jump in here.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask one question just to get an understanding. So if we think about meaning, and I understand the thermodynamics of meaning concept, and the idea that, as you've been talking about, is that what is meaningful to us is something that gives us more ability or causes our persistence into the future. So the cake. Thank you for keep talking about cake. My stomach is just like, give me cake. But I wanted to ask you what you think about that definition, that form of meaning. I'm not sure what the right noun is to put on it, but that conception of meaning versus what somebody might think of more commonly in this sort of form of meaning and other things. So for instance, I could say a cake, I understand it, persistence in the future. I could tell you that the noise that the aspens make outside my window is meaningful to me because it reminds me of my childhood in Maine listening to the birch leaves. That has nothing directly that I can associate with my persistence into the future. So I wonder, there's sort of two different ideas. One is that the thermodynamics of meaning is a portion of meaning overall to us as humans. But I kind of wondered whether you were going to tell me that perhaps thermodynamics of meaning is the entirety. We just don't understand the connection between the fact that I love those trees and I want to live in those trees, and that does actually give me a greater ability to persist into the future. Like I just don't have enough understanding of it. That I've somehow find meaning in things that encourage my persistence, even if I can't see that connection.
I now want cake. Yeah.
God.
In the context of that makes life worth living, or in the context of just the sound of them?
I'm not sure. And there could be a third option if I could just make things really confusing, because I embrace the fact that you said that you're not sort of worried about the definitions of particular words as much. It could be that the other things that we think of as meaningful are a different category to you than than persistence into the future.
Very interesting question. In the paper, we're careful to call these things semantic value of information.
Yeah.
And we're very sort of careful about the language. And so I would not necessarily say that. Okay. Remember that I said that one of the roads into this particular strange little cabinet of curiosities, to really mix metaphors, was that whatever else one's utility function it involves as an agent in the broadest sense of that word, it involves persisting into the future. But look at that caveat, whatever else. It's not denying that there is other else. It's saying that, so necessary but not sufficient. Aspens will be, frankly, will not mean anything to you if you're dead.
True.
If you're just grinning as a skull 6 feet under, nope, that's got no semantic value information to you in anybody's definition of the term.
But maintaining that meaning.
So being able to have it, yeah. So it's not an either or, I would say. It's necessary, but not sufficient. For me to be able to live without getting too hungry, etc., that's necessary to be able to value, and I certainly do, by the way, the sounds of aspens in the background. Share that with you. Don't know about cake, maybe that as well. But that's going to be something that somebody else, say for example, somebody who's been a city boy in Manhattan their entire life, might not have. But both us and them, we're going to actually have share that we want to persist, and therefore we need sufficient calories, etc., etc. So it's a more of a universal bedrock, I would say, on top of which can be overlaid other senses of the semantic value of information. There's all kinds of things. One could view it as almost like a side effect that no, aspens, that natural selection designed humans to prefer environments that reminded them of the one in which they were raised under the supposition that the one in which they were raised was actually a pleasant one. Makes sense. I'm natural selection. I'm designing humans. Put that in. Bing, bang, done. A side effect of that is going to be you're going to like the sound of aspens because you, as you said, were raised in an environment where you had that sound, and it was, supposing here you had a nice childhood, and so on and so forth. So one could actually perhaps even imagine explaining all of that from an evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology point of view, that this is a good way for natural selection to have quote-unquote designed the preferences of human adults is, if I had a good childhood, try to seek out those kinds of aspects of my environment that are the same as in my childhood. And it just so happens that there's this sneaky thing that aspens make the same kind of a sound as birches, but what really is going after you is go back to the birches. But all of that would be over and on top of that you want to persist into the future, which is where the thermodynamics stuff comes in. Yeah. So it's very, very much a variegated kind of a beast. That one universal is going to be the thermodynamic one. All entities are going to share that, but that doesn't mean that that is all that they actually have in their definitions of semantics. So that's the way that I would view it.
Yeah, there's something here that's intriguing to me that, one of the things we look for is an ability for an AI to describe something to us that we don't understand ourselves. And it could be based on our limitations of our own understandings of the world, our own understandings of our own worlds. We find that in all kinds of things. There's colleagues of yours at SFI that have explained complexity theory to me in a way that not sure I still truly understand. It seems to be outside of the ability of my mind to connect these things, right? So, but then you think about this in terms of meaning, and one of the things that's sort of intriguing to me is, might it be possible for a system like an AI that can see in unlimited dimensions, can see patterns across things that we can't understand, that might it be possible to explain to me why something is meaningful to me, because it can connect some of the choices that I'm making because I think colloquially that it's meaningful, and it actually can show me how it actually is helping me persist into the future. And I wouldn't necessarily make that connection. And I know I'm highly speculative and it might be a totally dopey idea, but there's something interesting about going back to the basis of what you said, the basics of what is truly meaningful is something that helps us persist into the future. And I think of all these other things that we make choices around, and how many of those are actually connected to our ability to persist in the future, but we can't conceptualize of how.
So one could almost imagine an extended prompt into an LLM transcript of this discussion. We could say there are things that in Dave's environment that are important for him persisting into the future. And they are going to include not just cake, but at one step removed, things like, being able to make the mortgage, having sufficient net positive revenue, et cetera, in our own little corporations that we all are. But there are other things that are of importance to Dave in addition to those, and give more examples. LLM, tell me what is it in the environment that would provide value to Dave in the second sense as well as the first. I'm sure there are people out there who are already saying to LLMs, what should I know about the markets right now to be able to figure out where to put my stocks? So we're not going to do anything new there. But here's a very interesting, in a certain sense, it's not a major novel extension, but it would still be really cool. Ask the LLM, here's a whole bunch of the things that Dave has liked learning about in the past. I'm sure actually people are doing this, but do it in a more systematic way. Find new ones that provide causal value of him in terms of his implicit exogenous utility function for what he enjoys. And some dumb things it might come up with is an app on your phone that sounds like birches. But it might also come up with things like the sounds of the seashore, or who knows.
We had a conversation recently with someone who had been talking to a young person, maybe 24, I think, who from the very start of Google Docs as a product had kept a daily journal since 2008 and had loaded the whole thing into an LLM to do exactly that. You know, tell me about my, like, the career choices, implicit preferences, how preferences have changed. And
so they kept the journal in a Google Doc, that's the idea?
Yeah, since 2008, and had put it into, I don't know if it was ChatGPT or Claude, it might have been Claude, but an LLM to do exactly that, to sort of, what are my implicit, how have I changed was, I think, the very starting point. What have I learned? How have I grown over time? But I think that's because what I'm trying to sort of get closer to here is want to bust out of really unimaginative, surface level ideas for how AI can actually help us as individuals. And so this deeper conversation about causal information from the environment, and being able to see that there's real value in that goes beyond just sort of simple folk pattern recognition that we've had. You know, if you pull up if you're really simple about the way, if you're really not sophisticated about the way they use AI, you just get kind of the same answer that everybody else gets. Like, I've got apps that just tell me to, be mindful for 5 minutes a day or whatever. I mean, that's kind of useless because it's the same information being given to everybody. And it's, how do you think about, now you've made me think, how do you think about prompting these in such a way that you're particularly getting AIs to start thinking about what's the causal information that is meaningful to me, that will change, that will be causal on my choices, not causal on his choices or anybody else's choices. That's kind of the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, and the key thing there is not just causal, but causal in a way that makes you value it. So maybe it's worth, and so I probably do have to go in, certainly within 15 minutes or so, if that would be okay.
Yeah.
But so it might be worth unpacking that word causal information a little bit. It's all based on the notion of intervention. So the cliche is that there's correlation between lung cancer and smoking. How do we know that that's actually correlational versus causal? There could be some gene that causes people to both like to smoke and to have lung cancer. How can we know this? How can we rule that out or not? Pearl's insight was that there are certain mathematical ways that if you intervene on the system, you can't tell just by looking at the statistics. Statistics tell you they're correlated. But if you intervene by, for example, here's a candidate gene, and I change the state of that gene, but I also change whether the person smokes or not, changing the state of the gene doesn't change if they get lung cancer. Changing whether they smoke or not does. That's me intervening in the system through changing the actual, going from correlations to causations. So the idea is a kind of a two-step thing. Find things in your environment that are not just their state is correlated with whether you're happy or not, because, for example, because that just could be correlational, so there's not going to be anything you can work on. But find things in your environment that provide causal value of information for your actually being happier, in the sense that when they have a causal effect on you, changing those things in your environment, then if that changes you, the result is you're happier. So it's not just finding things in your environment that are correlated with you and being happy, because that could be due to other kinds of things. So you're trying to change their state's not going to have any value for you. Rather, it's going to be finding those things in your environment such that modifying their state causally affects your behavior in a way, or not just your behavior, that of others, in a way that actually increases your future happiness. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. So the next question I have there, and it's sort of it's a question, but it's also making me think about it, because Pearl has his ladder of causation, right? So correlation, causation, and then counterfactuals. So how do we think about counterfactuals in that regard? Like, is there a different...
Yep. Okay, very good. So the first part of this, just the causal, would be that you find out that it's not just correlational. What would be a good example? I'm trying to think of like cakes or aspens. Nothing's quite coming to mind.
Well, the teenager, maybe.
Maybe, I don't know. We'll come up with something. But the first one would be to say, I'm not just trying to find those things in your environment that are correlated with your being happy, because that doesn't provide you any recommendations for what you should do to be happier. Fine. You are happier when there's a really great song that you really love that you just found on the radio. Okay, good. That doesn't provide you anything that's actionable. It's not dispositive, as the phrase goes. We want to find things you can do to your environment that will make you happier. That is causal. But then the next step is to say, okay, here is something that if you were to do that, it would actually have a major effect on your happiness. Cool, we've identified that variable. We still haven't said what it is you want to do to that variable. And that's where the counterfactuals would be. So it's first, I don't want to just know that these are the things in your environment that are correlated with your happy. I want to know what are the things in the environment that if they actually are changed appropriately, that will then, which they can be done, that will change your happiness. You could be happy when there's a song on the radio, nothing to do with that particular song, and you're enjoying it. It could be that whatever caused the DJ to put the song on the radio was some event that also made you happy. Could be completely correlational, not causative. So it's not of any kind of value to you. Causative would be knowing that, no, it is when Helen heard that song, that is not just correlated with her happiness, but that caused her to be happy. Then the next step, the counterfactuals, would be saying, okay, and now we want to have Helen be listening to this song as well, because that one will then cause her to be happy. So that's where Pearl's third level stage of counterfactuals might come into play.
I can see how, I mean, we think about counterfactuals with AI design a lot, because it's like a simulation that you can put in front of yourself that you don't have to live, but you can still have that same feeling that changes how you want to live. You know what I mean? That the simulation itself is very meaningful, even though you don't actually have to live it.
Yeah, you might see, for example, just how fragile the world's geopolitical order is by running some counterfactuals or something like that, to just pick a random notion.
Well, it's very much top of mind at the moment. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I could continue on for another couple of hours on two other subjects. One is how you're thinking about what AI could know that we could never know, and what that would mean for us. And the other one being, are we going through a big transition here to do with how much the complexification of our information system and how we think about what we compute across our societies. Those two things consume us in the artificiality. Some days we have to bring it back to down a ladder to this is why you should start using AI and why you should even know how to query ChatGPT. But most of the time, our minds are pretty consumed with what's it going to be, what's it going to mean to be human as we go through this, what we think this transition is going to do to us. And I know that that you've had some thoughts on this, and might be the topic of another conversation, but maybe leave us with a teaser.
Here's a seed. So here's another set of projects I'm involved with that still is related to my work on distributed AIs. Do you remember the flash crashes? Did you know about the flash crashes?
Mm-hmm.
Those, we still do not understand what caused them. There have not been any regulations that have ever been put in place to prevent one from occurring again, because we don't know what those regulations would prevent. We don't know the actual physics, so to speak, of the flash crash. We do know this. They were caused by very, very simple brain-dead bots that had fiduciary authority to trade on people's behalves, where these were just, they're called production systems. They were glorified if-then statements back in the day. We are not there yet, but we will be soon in the following world, where we don't have bots that have fiduciary authority. We have foundational AI models that are interacting in the same way with the same speed. And oh, by the way, they can also then give them a little bit more flexibility. They can be interacting with smart contracts, blockchain kinds of smart contracts. Guess what? Smart contracts are what's called Turing complete. What this means is that the interaction of all those AIs that we are going to be seeing within the next 5 years or so. I've talked to people at the top of the blockchain companies, Ethereum and so on, Vitalik and whatnot. They are all saying, yep, this is likely to be the case, but I'm right now heads down focused on keeping my company afloat for the next 6 months. So I've not found anybody who knows this world who's actually said, no, this is not going to happen. It looks like it will. And we have no reason to suppose that what will happen is not going to be the flash crash on steroids. But now think about this. Because those smart contracts are Turing complete, so seeing that, I have been involved with projects for a while trying to come up with any kind of models, and I can point to some papers in economics, any kinds of models of what might come out of this. But we kept running into the problems that we couldn't find. These models were just, they elaborate out to infinity. We couldn't put our hands around them to get something that this is the extent of the space. Then we realized, because you've got smart contracts, that means arbitrary, just like humans under the Turing thesis, arbitrary interactions between these bots that are in blockchain. What that means is that this can all be what's called Turing uncomputable. That means you can't even write down the mathematical equations to describe what is likely to be happening. Never mind try to solve for them. To put it another way, I'll be very careful with my language here. I have, by talking to the various people in the economics world and in the blockchain world and so on, not come up with anybody who disagrees with the fact that, yeah, the singularity might be here within 5 years, but it's not going to be with a monolithic AGI. This is something we should have learned back in the 20th century. Everything of consequence is distributed. The singularity, in the formal sense, it's Turing uncomputable. Our mathematics can't handle it. It is very possible that it was going to be here soon, but it's going to be distributed. It's not going to be singular. It's not going to be one LLM. Who gives a flying leap about one LLM? You have them all interacting without any kinds of constraints, because we don't know how to constrain them. And then allow them to be interacting with smart contracts. The flash crash, we still don't know what happened. So in that sense, it was a mini singularity.
Yeah, we wrote about that paper. I should send you the link to it. But yeah, it kind of breaks my brain to think that we can see that collective intelligence happening. We just have, and we can see that we can't see past it. I mean, that's essentially what your essay said, right? We can't see past that singularity, which is essentially a collective intelligence of distributed AI agents.
Yeah, it's going to happen, sure, but it's going to be distributed.
Yeah.
The issue is not, can one particular foundational model make me feel that it's understanding or something like that. That ain't the issue. This is the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a world where it feels like we're diverging constantly on everything, perhaps the work you're doing now is one thing that we can all unify behind as something that's meaningful and is important to our collective persistence in the future.
Nice way of summarizing.
Is understanding how to prevent a mass flash crash
in
an uncomputable way.
And keep linking the unlinkable.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for this. This has been fantastic. Really wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to do it again.
Yep. Thank you, folks.